The desert stretched endlessly under the merciless afternoon sun, a vast expanse of sand and rock where silence reigned supreme. The temperature hovered around 108 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air shimmered with heat waves that distorted the horizon. In this unforgiving landscape, where even the hardiest cacti struggled to survive, Margaret Torres found herself in a nightmare she never could have imagined. At 79 years old, Margaret had lived a life defined by dedication and sacrifice. Her weathered hands told stories of decades spent working multiple jobs to provide for her children. Her eyes, though dimmed by age, still held the warmth of a woman who had loved unconditionally. But now those same eyes were filled with confusion, pain, and a dawning horror as she realized what her own children had done to her. She was bound to a rusted utility pole on the side of a desolate highway, her wrists tied so tightly with rough rope that it cut into her papery skin. Her ankles were similarly secured, forcing her to stand in an awkward position that sent shooting pains through her arthritic knees. The sun beat down on her grey hair, and she could feel the moisture being drawn from her body with each passing minute. Her lips were already cracking, and her tongue felt thick and swollen in her mouth. Margaret's mind reeled as she tried to process what had happened. Just hours ago, she had been at home, believing she was going on a family outing with her son David and daughter Patricia. They had told her they wanted to take her somewhere special, somewhere she could enjoy the fresh air and beautiful scenery. In her innocence and trust, she had eagerly agreed, happy for the rare opportunity to spend time with her children, who had grown increasingly distant over the past year. The drive had been long and quiet. David, 47 years old with prematurely greying temples, had kept his eyes fixed on the road, his jaw clenched in a way Margaret couldn't quite interpret. Patricia, 42, had sat in the back seat with their mother but had avoided eye contact, staring out the window with an expression that seemed both guilty and resolute. Margaret had tried to make conversation, asking about her grandchildren and their jobs, but received only terse, monosyllabic responses. When they finally pulled off the main highway onto a dirt road that led deeper into the desert, Margaret had felt the first stirrings of unease. "Where are we going?" she had asked, her voice trembling slightly. "This doesn't look like any park I know." "It's a surprise, Mom," Patricia had said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Just trust us." And Margaret had trusted them. Even as they drove further from civilization, even as the landscape became more barren and desolate, she had trusted her children. Because that's what mothers do. They trust the babies they brought into the world, the children they nursed through illnesses, the teenagers they worried about through sleepless nights, the adults they continued to love despite their flaws and failings. When the car finally stopped in the middle of nowhere, next to a lonely utility pole that stood like a sentinel in the wasteland, Margaret's confusion had deepened. David had gotten out first, walking around to open her door with an expression she couldn't read. "Come on, Mom," he had said, "let's stretch our legs." Margaret had stepped out of the air-conditioned vehicle into the wall of heat, immediately feeling overwhelmed by the intensity of the sun. And then, before she could understand what was happening, David had grabbed her arms while Patricia produced the rope. Margaret had struggled, her elderly body no match for her son's strength, crying out in bewilderment and fear. "What are you doing? Why are you doing this?" Neither of them had answered. They had worked with grim efficiency, binding her to the pole while she pleaded and wept. And then, without a word of explanation or goodbye, they had gotten back in the car and driven away, leaving her there to die. Now, as Margaret stood trembling in the desert heat, her mind grappled with the incomprehensible cruelty of what her children had done. She thought back over her life, desperately searching for some explanation, some clue that might make sense of this monstrous betrayal. She remembered David as a baby, how he had cried inconsolably for hours, until she discovered he was allergic to the formula and switched to a more expensive brand she could barely afford. She remembered Patricia as a little girl, how she had held Margaret's hand so tightly on her first day of school, and how Margaret had reassured her that everything would be all right. She remembered working double shifts at the diner, while also cleaning houses on weekends to pay for their school supplies, their clothes, their activities. She remembered going without meals so they could eat, wearing the same threadbare coat for years so they could have new ones. After their father left when David was 12 and Patricia was 7, Margaret had become both mother and father to them. She had attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every sports game. She had helped with homework late into the night, even though she was exhausted from work. She had taught them right from wrong, encouraged their dreams and loved them with every fibre of her being. Where had it all gone wrong? Margaret's thoughts drifted to the past year, when things had begun to change. She had started having more difficulty managing on her own. Her arthritis had worsened, making it hard to open jars or climb stairs. Her memory had become spotty, causing her to forget appointments or repeat stories. She had fallen twice, once in the bathroom and once on the front steps, thankfully without serious injury. She had begun to realize that she might need help, might need to move in with one of her children, or consider an assisted living facility. But when she had broached the subject with David and Patricia, their reactions had been cold. David had immediately talked about how his house was too small, how his wife Karen wouldn't be comfortable with that arrangement. Patricia had cited her demanding job and her teenage children as reasons why she couldn't take Margaret in. Neither had offered to help find or pay for a care facility. Then there had been the matter of Margaret's house. It was a modest 3-bedroom home in a decent neighborhood, fully paid off, probably worth around $300,000. Margaret had mentioned that she might need to sell it to afford proper care in her declining years. The look that had passed between her children at that moment should have warned her, but she had been too trusting, too loving to recognize the greed in their eyes. Over the following months, David and Patricia had begun pressuring her to sign the house over to them. They had used every manipulation tactic they could think of, from appeals to family loyalty, to veiled threats about ending up in a horrible state facility. Margaret had resisted, not out of suspicion, but because she wanted to make sure she could afford quality care and not be a burden to anyone. And now, standing tied to this pole in the merciless desert, Margaret understood. Her children didn't want to wait for her to die naturally. They didn't want to spend money on her care. They wanted her house, her modest savings, her social security benefits, and they wanted them now. So they had decided to murder her in a way that would look like she had wandered off in confusion and died of exposure. The realization was more painful than the physical agony of the ropes, the heat, and her aching joints. Margaret had spent her entire adult life for these two people, and they had repaid her by sentencing her to death in the most cruel and cowardly way imaginable. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks, evaporating almost as quickly as they fell in the intense heat. She tried to call for help, but her voice came out as a hoarse croak, barely audible even to herself. The highway was visible in the distance, but no cars had passed since her children had left. This stretch of road was notoriously empty, connecting two small towns across a vast expanse of desert. That's why they had chosen it. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret felt herself growing weaker. Her vision began to blur, and she could feel her heart racing irregularly in her chest. Dehydration was setting in quickly, and she knew that at her age, with her health conditions, she didn't have much time. She thought of her grandchildren, whom she would never see again. She thought of the life she had lived, all the struggles and joys, all the love she had given, and how it had come to this terrible end. Just as she was beginning to lose consciousness, Margaret heard something that seemed like a hallucination at first. The sound of an engine. She forced her eyes open, squinting against the sun, and saw a vehicle in the distance, approaching along the highway. Hope surged through her, giving her a burst of energy she didn't know she still possessed. With every ounce of strength she had left, Margaret tried to make herself visible, moving her bound body as much as possible, trying to wave, trying to make any motion that might catch the driver's attention. The vehicle was getting closer. It was a pickup truck she could see now, moving at a moderate speed along the highway. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please see me. Please stop." The truck drew nearer, and Margaret's heart pounded with desperate hope. This was her only chance. If this vehicle passed by without seeing her, she knew she wouldn't survive long enough for another opportunity. She gathered every last bit of her strength and tried to scream, producing a sound that was part cry, part sob, full of anguish and desperate need. And then, miraculously, she saw the truck's brake lights illuminate. The vehicle began to slow down, pulling off the highway onto the dirt shoulder. Someone had seen her. Someone was stopping to help. Margaret's body sagged with relief, even as she remained bound to the pole. She watched through tear-blurred eyes as two figures emerged from the truck and began running toward her. A man and a woman, their faces etched with shock and concern as they took in the horrifying scene before them. "Oh my God," she heard the woman say. "Someone call 911. This woman needs help immediately." As they reached her, already working to untie the cruel ropes, Margaret felt consciousness beginning to slip away. But before the darkness claimed her, she heard the man's voice, firm and reassuring. "You're going to be okay. We've got you. You're safe now." And for the first time in hours, despite everything that had happened, Margaret allowed herself to believe those words. The emergency room at Desert Valley Medical Center was a symphony of controlled chaos. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the polished linoleum floors. The smell of antiseptic mingled with the underlying scent of fear and pain that seemed to permeate every hospital. But in room 7, there was a sense of quiet urgency as medical staff worked to save Margaret Torres's life. Dr. Sarah Chen, a 38-year-old emergency physician with 12 years of experience, had seen many difficult cases in her career. But when the paramedics had wheeled Margaret in 45 minutes earlier, even she had been shaken by the severity of the situation. The elderly woman had been barely conscious, severely dehydrated, suffering from heat stroke and showing signs of shock. Her vital signs had been dangerously unstable, and the marks on her wrists and ankles told a story that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Somebody did this to her," Sarah had said to her nurse, Marcus Thompson, a 42-year-old veteran of emergency medicine who had worked alongside her for years. This wasn't an accident or a case of someone wandering off confused. Someone deliberately tied this woman up and left her to die. Marcus had nodded grimly, his dark eyes reflecting the same anger and disbelief that Sarah felt. The couple who found her said she was tied to a utility pole about 30 miles out on Highway 47. They said if they'd been even 30 minutes later, she probably wouldn't have made it. Now, as Margaret's condition gradually stabilized under their care, Sarah stepped out of the room to speak with the couple who had saved her life. They were sitting in the waiting area, still visibly shaken by what they had witnessed. The man was tall and lean, probably in his early 50s, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes. The woman beside him was slightly younger, with shoulder-length brown hair, and a face marked by concern and compassion. "Mr. and Mrs. Patterson," Sarah approached them, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Chen. I wanted to thank you personally for what you did today. You saved that woman's life." James Patterson stood, shaking Sarah's hand firmly. His wife, Linda, rose beside him. "How is she, Doctor?" Linda asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Is she going to be okay?" "She's stable now," Sarah replied, gesturing for them to sit back down as she pulled up a chair to join them. "She was in critical condition when she arrived, suffering from severe dehydration, heat stroke and shock, but we've got her on IV fluids. We're monitoring her closely, and I believe she's going to pull through. Thanks entirely to you two." James shook his head, his expression troubled. "We almost didn't see her. We were on our way back from visiting Linda's sister in Millbrook, and we almost took the interstate instead of the old highway. Something just made me choose the scenic route." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "When we saw her there, tied up like that, in the middle of nowhere under that brutal sun, I've never seen anything like it in my life." Linda reached for her husband's hand, tears welling in her eyes. She was barely conscious when we got to her. She kept trying to say something, but her voice was so weak. "We called 911 immediately, and James got water from our cooler. We tried to keep her cool while we waited for the ambulance. You did exactly the right things," Sarah assured them. "Your quick thinking and compassion made all the difference." She hesitated, then asked, "Did she say anything to you? Anything about who might have done this to her?" James and Linda exchanged a glance. "Not really," James said slowly. "She was mostly incoherent, but right before the ambulance arrived, she did say something that I'll never forget. She looked right at me and whispered, 'My children.' That's all. Just those 2 words. 'My children.'" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Her children did this to her. "That's what it sounded like," Linda confirmed, wiping at her eyes. "I can't imagine. I have 3 children of my own, and the thought that anyone could do this to their own mother." She couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah stood, her mind already racing with the implications. "I need to report this to the police immediately. This is attempted murder, and if her own children are responsible—" She paused, taking a deep breath to control her anger. "Would you two be willing to speak with the police and give a statement about what you saw?" "Absolutely," James said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes to make sure whoever did this faces justice." Sarah nodded gratefully and headed back toward Margaret's room, stopping at the nurse's station to make the necessary calls. Within 20 minutes, Detective Robert Morrison arrived at the hospital. He was a seasoned investigator in his mid-50s, with gray hair, sharp blue eyes, and the weary but determined expression of someone who had seen too much of humanity's dark side. After speaking with the Pattersons and reviewing Margaret's medical records, Detective Morrison entered her room. Margaret was awake now, though still weak and disoriented. Her grey hair was plastered to her head with sweat, and her face was sunburned and drawn with exhaustion. But her eyes were clear, and when she saw the detective, she seemed to understand why he was there. "Mrs. Torres," Morrison said gently, pulling a chair close to her bedside. "I'm Detective Morrison. I know you've been through a terrible ordeal, and I'm sorry to have to ask you questions right now, but it's important that we get your statement while everything is still fresh in your memory. Can you tell me what happened to you today?" Margaret's lips trembled, and for a moment Morrison thought she might break down. But she gathered her strength, her voice hoarse but steady as she began to speak. "My son David and my daughter Patricia came to my house this morning. They said they wanted to take me on a drive, somewhere special. I was so happy that they wanted to spend time with me. They've been so distant lately." She paused, accepting a sip of water that the nurse offered her, then continued. "We drove for a long time. I didn't recognize where we were going. When I asked, they just said it was a surprise. Then they pulled off the highway, onto a dirt road. There was nothing out there, just desert and that pole." Her voice broke. "They tied me up. My own children tied me up and left me there to die." Morrison felt his jaw tighten with anger, but he kept his voice calm and professional. "Mrs. Torres, I need you to tell me their full names and any contact information you have for them." "David Andrew Torres," Margaret said, tears now streaming down her face. "He lives at 327 Maple Street. He's 47 years old, works as a sales manager at an appliance store. My daughter is Patricia Ann Torres Henderson. She's 42, lives at 815 Oak Ridge Drive. She's a regional manager for a retail chain." Morrison wrote down the information, his mind already formulating the next steps of the investigation. "Mrs. Torres, do you have any idea why they would do this to you?" Margaret closed her eyes, the pain of the answer almost too much to bear. "My house," she whispered. "They wanted my house. I've been having some health problems lately, and I told them I might need to sell it to pay for care. They wanted me to sign it over to them instead. When I said I needed to think about it, they kept pressuring me. I never thought they would—" She couldn't continue. Morrison reached out and gently patted her hand. "Mrs. Torres, I promise you that we're going to make sure your children face justice for what they've done. No one deserves what happened to you, especially not from their own family." As Morrison left the hospital to begin the process of obtaining arrest warrants, Margaret lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. The physical pain of her ordeal was gradually subsiding thanks to the medical care she was receiving, but the emotional anguish was overwhelming. How had she raised two people capable of such monstrous cruelty? Where had she gone wrong? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Linda Patterson entered, carrying a small bouquet of flowers from the hospital gift shop. "I hope you don't mind," Linda said softly. "I wanted to check on you before we left, to make sure you were okay." Margaret looked at this stranger who had saved her life, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "You saved me," she said simply. "You and your husband. You stopped when my own children left me to die." Linda set the flowers on the bedside table and pulled up a chair, taking Margaret's weathered hand in hers. "I'm just grateful we were there," she said. "My husband and I have been talking, and we want you to know that you're not alone. Whatever you need during your recovery, we're here to help." "But you don't even know me," Margaret protested weakly. "That doesn't matter," Linda replied firmly. "What matters is that you're a human being who deserves kindness and compassion. What your children did to you is unforgivable, but it doesn't define you or your worth. You survived, Mrs. Torres. You're strong, and you're going to get through this." Margaret squeezed Linda's hand, unable to speak through her tears. For the first time since her nightmare had begun, she felt a glimmer of something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. Not hope that her children would somehow be different than what they had proven themselves to be, but hope that perhaps there was still goodness in the world, still people who cared about others, without ulterior motives. Meanwhile, across town, David Torres was sitting in his living room, watching television with his wife Karen. They had returned from their desert excursion hours ago, and David had been trying to act normal, to push away the image of his mother's pleading face as they drove away. Karen, who had been complicit in the plan from the beginning, kept glancing at him nervously. "Do you think anyone will find her?" Karen asked in a whisper, even though they were alone in the house. "Not in time," David replied, his voice flat. "That road is almost never used. By the time anyone happens by, it'll be too late. It'll look like she wandered off confused and got lost. Happens to old people all the time. And then the house will be ours, Karen said, a note of satisfaction in her voice. $300,000. Free and clear. We can finally pay off our debts and have some real money for once. David nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He kept seeing his mother's face, kept hearing her voice asking why, kept remembering all the sacrifices she had made for him when he was growing up. For a moment, he felt a pang of something that might have been guilt or remorse, but he pushed it down. It was too late for second thoughts now. What was done was done. At her own home, Patricia Torres Henderson was having similar thoughts. She sat at her kitchen table staring at her phone, fighting the urge to call David and make sure everything had gone according to plan. Her husband Mark was upstairs putting their teenage daughters to bed, unaware of what his wife had done that afternoon. Patricia had told him she was taking her mother to a doctor's appointment. Patricia tried to convince herself that what they had done was justified. Her mother was old, her quality of life was declining, and she would have died eventually anyway. Why should her house and money be wasted on expensive care facilities when her children needed it more? They had endured childhoods marked by poverty because of their mother's poor choices. Didn't they deserve to benefit now? But no matter how many times Patricia tried to rationalize their actions, she couldn't escape the memory of her mother's terrified eyes, couldn't forget the sound of her pleading voice. She poured herself a large glass of wine and drank it quickly, hoping to numb the feelings that threatened to overwhelm her. Neither David nor Patricia had any idea that at that very moment, Detective Morrison was meeting with the district attorney, presenting the evidence and obtaining arrest warrants. Neither of them knew that their mother had survived, had been rescued, and had told the authorities everything. Neither of them imagined that their carefully planned murder would unravel so quickly and completely. The clock was ticking, and justice was coming for them both. The dawn broke over the city with streaks of pink and orange painting the sky, but David Torres wouldn't see the sunrise. At 5:45 in the morning, Detective Robert Morrison and 4 uniformed officers stood outside David's modest single-story home on Maple Street. The neighborhood was quiet, with only a few early risers beginning their day. Morrison had deliberately chosen this early hour for the arrests, wanting to catch both suspects before they had a chance to communicate with each other or attempt to flee. Morrison raised his fist and pounded firmly on the front door. "Police, open up!" His voice cut through the morning silence like a knife. Inside, David jolted awake, his heart racing with sudden panic. Beside him, Karen sat up with a gasp. "What's happening?" she whispered, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the curtains. David's stomach dropped as the pounding continued. Somehow, impossibly, he knew why they were there. "Stay here," he told Karen, his voice shaking as he pulled on a robe and made his way to the front door. His hands trembled as he unlocked it and pulled it open to find Detective Morrison's stern face staring back at him. "David Andrew Torres?" Morrison asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes," David managed to say, his mouth suddenly dry. "You're under arrest for the attempted murder of Margaret Torres. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Morrison's voice was cold and professional, but his eyes burned with barely contained anger. "What? No, there must be some mistake," David stammered, even as 2 officers moved forward to restrain him. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Save it for your lawyer," Morrison said, snapping the handcuffs onto David's wrists with perhaps a bit more force than necessary. "Margaret Torres is alive, Mr. Torres. She's in the hospital recovering from the ordeal you and your sister put her through. She's told us everything." The color drained completely from David's face. "She's alive?" The words came out as barely a whisper, a mixture of shock and horror. His carefully constructed plan, his assumption that his mother would never be found in time, had crumbled to dust. Karen appeared in the hallway, clutching her robe around her, her eyes wide with fear. "David, what's going on?" "Your husband attempted to murder his elderly mother yesterday," Morrison informed her bluntly. "He and his sister drove her out to the desert, tied her to a utility pole, and left her to die in the heat. Fortunately, a passing couple found her in time and saved her life." Karen's hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment, Morrison wondered if she had known about the plan, but that was a question for later. Right now, he had another arrest to make. As the officers led David out to the patrol car, neighbors began to emerge from their homes drawn by the commotion. They watched in shock and whispered speculation, as David, still in his robe and pajamas, was placed in the back of the police cruiser. Karen stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, already wondering how she would explain this to their friends, their family, their community. Across town, Patricia Torres Henderson was having coffee in her kitchen when she heard the vehicles pull up outside. She looked out the window and saw multiple police cars, and her blood turned to ice. For a moment she considered running, perhaps out the back door, but where would she go? And besides, her legs suddenly felt like they couldn't support her weight. The knock came, loud and authoritative. Patricia's husband, Mark, who had been upstairs getting ready for work, came down the stairs with a confused expression. "Who could that be at this hour?" he asked. Patricia couldn't answer. She couldn't move. She could only watch as Mark opened the door, and Detective Morrison, along with several uniformed officers, stood on their front porch. "Patricia Ann Torres Henderson?" Morrison asked, looking past Mark to where Patricia stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. "That's my wife," Mark said, his confusion deepening. "What's this about?" "Mrs. Torres Henderson, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Margaret Torres," Morrison announced, moving into the house. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Patricia's legs finally gave out and she sank to the floor, her coffee mug slipping from her fingers and shattering on the tile. Mark stared in absolute shock, unable to process what he was hearing. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice hollow. "Patricia would never... she couldn't... Your wife and her brother drove their 79-year-old mother into the desert yesterday, tied her to a utility pole and abandoned her to die," Morrison said, his voice hard. "Mrs. Torres nearly died from dehydration and heat stroke. She's currently recovering in the hospital, and she's given us a full statement about what happened." Mark looked at his wife, searching her face for some denial, some explanation that would make this nightmare make sense. But what he saw there was guilt and fear and a terrible resignation. "Patricia," he whispered, "tell me this isn't true." But Patricia couldn't meet his eyes. She allowed the officers to help her to her feet and place handcuffs on her wrists. As they led her out of the house, her teenage daughters appeared at the top of the stairs, their faces confused and frightened. "Mom!" the older one called out. "What's happening?" Patricia closed her eyes, unable to bear the sight of her children watching her be arrested. She had destroyed everything, she realized. Not just her relationship with her mother, not just her freedom, but her children's respect, her husband's trust, her entire life. And for what? A house she would never live in, money she would never spend. By mid-morning, both David and Patricia were being processed at the county jail. They were kept separate, unable to communicate with each other, each lost in their own private hell of regret and fear. The bail hearing was scheduled for the following day, and both knew that bail would likely be set extremely high, if granted at all, given the severity of the charges and the particularly heinous nature of their crime. At the hospital, Margaret was sitting up in bed, feeling physically stronger though emotionally devastated. Detective Morrison had called to inform her that both of her children were in custody, and while part of her felt a grim satisfaction that they would face justice, another part of her felt only an overwhelming sadness. These were her babies, the children she had brought into the world and raised with all the love she had to give. How had it come to this? Dr. Sarah Chen entered the room with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Torres. How are you feeling today?" "Better, physically," Margaret replied honestly, still trying to process everything emotionally. Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down, her expression sympathetic. "I can only imagine what you're going through, but I want you to know that you're showing remarkable resilience. Your vital signs are much improved, and if you continue to recover at this rate, we may be able to discharge you in a few days." "Discharge me to where?" Margaret asked, the reality of her situation suddenly hitting her. "I can't go back to my house, not alone, not after what happened." Sarah had anticipated this concern. "We have a social worker, Janet Rodriguez, who specializes in helping patients transition to safe living situations. She's going to come speak with you later today about your options. There are assisted living facilities, senior communities, and other resources available. You won't be abandoned, Mrs. Torres. I promise you that." As if on cue, there was a knock on the door, and Linda Patterson entered, carrying a small overnight bag. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I brought you some things I thought you might need. Some comfortable clothes, toiletries, a book to read. I wasn't sure what you liked, so I just guessed." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes once again. This woman, this complete stranger, was showing her more kindness and consideration than her own children had shown in years. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I wanted to," Linda replied simply, setting the bag down and taking a seat on the other side of Margaret's bed. "James and I have been talking, and we have a proposition for you. Our house has a guest suite with a private bathroom. It's just sitting empty since our youngest moved out last year. We'd like you to stay with us while you recover and figure out your next steps. No pressure, no strings attached. Just a safe, comfortable place to heal." Margaret stared at her in disbelief. "But why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." Linda reached out and took Margaret's hand. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because you deserve kindness and support. Because maybe this is why James and I took that particular road yesterday, why we were meant to find you. I don't claim to understand the universe's plan, but I do know that when you see someone in need, and you have the ability to help, you should help." Dr. Chen watched this exchange with a warm feeling in her chest. In her years practicing medicine, she had seen the worst of humanity, but she had also seen the best. This moment definitely fell into the latter category. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said. "It would give you time to heal in a supportive environment while you work with our social worker to determine your long-term plans." Margaret didn't know what to say. She had gone from being abandoned by her own children to being embraced by strangers who owed her nothing. The contrast was almost too much to bear. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you," she finally managed to say. "You don't need to repay us," Linda assured her. "Just focus on getting better, that's all we ask." Later that afternoon, Janet Rodriguez, a compassionate woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, came to discuss Margaret's options. She laid out various possibilities, from assisted living facilities to senior apartments to continuing care retirement communities. She also discussed Margaret's financial situation, reviewing her social security income, her modest savings, and the equity in her home. "The good news is that you have options," Janet explained. "Your house is paid off, which gives you significant flexibility. If you decide to sell it, you'll have enough to afford quality care for many years. There are also reverse mortgage options if you want to stay in your home, and there are community programs that can provide in-home support services." "I don't think I can go back to that house," Margaret said quietly. "Every time I look at it, I'll remember that my children were willing to kill me to get it. It's tainted now." Janet nodded understandingly. "That's a completely valid feeling. Many people in situations like yours find that a fresh start in a new location helps with the healing process. Why don't we look at some assisted living communities that have both independent living options and additional care services available if you need them in the future? That way you have security and support, but also independence." Over the next hour, they reviewed several options, and Margaret found herself feeling cautiously optimistic about the future. One facility in particular caught her attention: Sunrise Senior Community, a well-maintained complex about 15 miles from where she currently lived. It offered independent apartments with optional meal plans, social activities, on-site medical staff, and a supportive community of other seniors. The cost was manageable if she sold her house, and there was even a small dog policy, which made Margaret smile as she remembered how she had always wanted a companion animal but had never gotten one because she was too busy working to care for it properly. As the sun began to set on her second day in the hospital, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of possibility. Yes, she had experienced the worst betrayal imaginable. Yes, her heart was broken and would probably never fully heal. But she was alive. She was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her well-being, and she had the opportunity to build a new life, one not defined by the cruelty of her children, but by her own resilience and the kindness of strangers who had become friends. Meanwhile, in their separate cells at the county jail, David and Patricia were experiencing very different emotions. David was consumed with anger, blaming everyone but himself for the situation. He was angry at his mother for not just signing over the house, angry at the couple who had found her, angry at the police for arresting him. In his twisted logic, he was the victim here, not his mother. Patricia, on the other hand, was drowning in guilt and regret. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's terrified face. She heard her pleading voice asking why. She felt the rough rope in her hands as they tied the knots. The reality of what she had done, what she had been willing to do, crashed over her in waves. She had been willing to murder her own mother for money. What kind of monster had she become? When her public defender, a young woman named Rebecca Santos, came to interview her, Patricia broke down completely. "I don't know what I was thinking," she sobbed. "I don't know how I let it get to this point. David kept talking about how much we deserved the house, how Mom was going to waste it all on care facilities, and somehow I convinced myself that it made sense. But it didn't. Nothing about what we did makes sense." Rebecca listened without judgment, taking notes. "Mrs. Torres Henderson, I need to be honest with you. This is an extremely serious charge. Attempted murder of a family member, particularly an elderly parent, is something that judges and juries take very seriously. The evidence against you is substantial. Your mother has given a detailed statement. There were witnesses who found her and can testify about her condition, and the physical evidence at the scene corroborates the story. Your best option, in my professional opinion, is to consider a plea deal." "A plea deal?" Patricia looked up, her face swollen from crying. "The district attorney will likely be willing to negotiate if you show genuine remorse, cooperate fully, and accept responsibility for your actions. It won't make this go away, but it could mean the difference between spending the rest of your life in prison and having some hope of eventual release." Patricia thought about her daughters, her husband, her mother. She thought about the life she had destroyed through her greed and weakness. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said quietly. "I deserve to be punished for what I did. I just want Mom to know that I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry." Rebecca nodded, making a note. "We'll explore that possibility. But you need to understand that your mother may not be willing or able to forgive you. You need to be prepared for that reality." Patricia nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. She understood that some betrayals were too deep, some wounds too severe to ever fully heal. She had destroyed her relationship with her mother, and she would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of her life. 3 months had passed since that terrible day in the desert, and the morning sun streamed through the windows of Margaret Torres's new apartment at Sunrise Senior Community. She sat in her comfortable armchair, a steaming cup of tea on the side table, watching her new companion, a small terrier mix named Hope, play with a squeaky toy on the carpet. The apartment was modest but cheerful, decorated with photographs of happier times and new paintings she had purchased from a local artist's gallery. Margaret had changed in those 3 months. Her physical wounds had healed completely, though she still bore the faint scars on her wrists where the ropes had cut into her skin. But the emotional healing had been slower, more complicated. She had good days and bad days, moments when she felt strong and optimistic, and moments when the weight of betrayal threatened to crush her spirit. Linda and James Patterson had been true to their word. Margaret had stayed with them for nearly 6 weeks after leaving the hospital, and they had become like family to her. They had helped her sort through her belongings at her old house, supported her through the difficult decision to sell it, and had been there for her through every step of her transition to Sunrise Senior Community. Even now they visited her twice a week, and Linda had become Margaret's closest friend. The legal proceedings had moved forward with surprising speed. The district attorney, a determined woman named Catherine Liu, had prosecuted the case vigorously, making it clear that the community would not tolerate such heinous crimes against vulnerable elderly citizens. The case had attracted significant media attention, with local news stations covering the story extensively. The headlines had been brutal: "Children attempt to murder elderly mother for inheritance," "Desert abandonment shocks community," "Greed and betrayal," "The Margaret Torres case." David had maintained his not guilty plea, continuing to blame everyone but himself. His lawyer had attempted various defense strategies, from claiming that Margaret had asked to be taken to the desert and the situation was a misunderstanding, to suggesting that she had memory problems and was confused about what had happened. But the evidence was overwhelming. The testimony from James and Linda Patterson, the medical records documenting Margaret's injuries and condition, the forensic evidence from the scene, and most damning of all, Margaret's own clear and consistent testimony had left no room for doubt. The trial had lasted 2 weeks, and Margaret had been required to testify. Sitting in that witness stand looking across the courtroom at her son had been one of the most difficult experiences of her life. David had stared at her with cold eyes, showing no remorse, no recognition of the magnitude of what he had done. When the guilty verdict was read, he had shown no emotion at all. The judge had sentenced him to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Patricia's path had been different. True to her word to her public defender, she had accepted a plea deal. In exchange for her cooperation, full acceptance of responsibility, and genuine expressions of remorse, the attempted murder charge had been reduced to aggravated assault and endangerment of a vulnerable adult. She had been sentenced to 12 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 8 years. Before sentencing, Patricia had been given the opportunity to address the court. Margaret had watched from the front row as her daughter, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, had stood before the judge with tears streaming down her face. "Your Honor, there is nothing I can say that will undo what I've done," Patricia had said, her voice breaking. "I betrayed my mother in the worst way imaginable. I let greed and selfishness turn me into a monster. My mother gave me everything, sacrificed everything for me and my brother, and I repaid her by trying to take her life. I will carry the shame and guilt of what I've done for the rest of my life." Then Patricia had turned to face Margaret directly, her eyes red and swollen. "Mom, I know you may never be able to forgive me. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to know that I am truly, deeply sorry. What I did was evil. There's no other word for it. You deserved so much better from me. You deserved a daughter who loved you and cared for you in your later years, not one who tried to murder you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Margaret had sat there, tears running down her own face, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Part of her wanted to stand up and shout that sorry wasn't enough, that apologies couldn't undo the trauma and betrayal. But another part of her, the part that had loved Patricia since the moment she was born, felt a tiny crack in the wall of anger and hurt she had built around her heart. Now, 3 months later, Margaret sat in her apartment holding a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from Patricia, the first communication they had had since the sentencing. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope and began to read. "Dear Mom," the letter began, "I don't know if you'll read this letter, or if you'll throw it away the moment you see it's from me. I would understand if you did. But I'm writing anyway because there are things I need to say to you, even if you never respond. Prison is hard, but I deserve every moment of difficulty I experience here. Every uncomfortable night on a thin mattress, every tasteless meal, every moment of fear and loneliness. I deserve it all. But the hardest part isn't the physical conditions. It's living with what I've done to you. I've had a lot of time to think about how I became someone capable of such cruelty. I've been meeting with a therapist here, trying to understand how I let greed consume me to the point where I was willing to murder my own mother. The therapist says that doesn't excuse what I did, but it might help me understand it and become a better person. I think about my childhood a lot. I remember how you worked multiple jobs to support us after Dad left. I remember coming home from school to find you exhausted, but still willing to help with homework, still making sure we had dinner, still trying to be both mother and father to us. I remember how you went without so we could have what we needed, and then I think about how I repaid all that sacrifice, and I feel sick. I threw away something precious, something irreplaceable. I had a mother who loved me unconditionally, and I destroyed that through my greed and selfishness. My daughters have visited me once. Mark brought them last month. It was the hardest conversation I've ever had. I had to look my teenage daughters in the eyes and admit what I had done to their grandmother. I watched their respect for me die, just as I killed your trust in me. They said they don't know if they can ever look at me the same way again. I told them I understood. Mom, I'm not writing this letter to ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and I'm not sure I'll ever deserve it. I'm writing because you deserve to know that what I did is eating me alive, as it should. You deserve to know that I recognize the enormity of my crime. You deserve to know that if I could go back and change everything, I would do it in a heartbeat. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're somewhere safe and comfortable. I hope you found people who treat you with the kindness and respect you've always deserved. I hope you're happy, or at least finding moments of peace. I love you, Mum. I know I have no right to say those words after what I've done, but they're true. They've always been true, even when I lost sight of them in my greed and darkness. I'm sorry. I will be sorry for the rest of my life. Your daughter, Patricia. Margaret set the letter down with shaking hands and picked up her cup of tea, taking a long sip as she tried to process her feelings. Hope, sensing her distress, jumped into her lap and nuzzled against her, and Margaret stroked the small dog's soft fur, finding comfort in the simple gesture. There was a knock at her door, and Margaret looked up to see Linda Patterson standing in the doorway with a warm smile. They had plans to have lunch together and then attend a watercolor painting class that the community center offered. "Am I too early?" Linda asked, noticing Margaret's emotional state. "I can come back later if you need time." "No, please come in," Margaret said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I just received a letter from Patricia, the first one since the sentencing." Linda sat down, her expression sympathetic. "How do you feel about that?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. "Conflicted," she finally said. "Part of me is still so angry, so hurt. What she and David did to me, it broke something fundamental. They were supposed to be the people who loved me most in the world, and they tried to kill me for money. How do you come back from that?" "I don't know if you can," Linda said honestly. "Some betrayals are so deep that the relationship can never be what it was before." "But then I read her words and I can hear genuine remorse," Margaret continued. "I can feel her pain and guilt. And there's a part of me, the part that held her as a baby and kissed her scraped knees and celebrated her accomplishments, that part still loves her. That part wants to believe she can change, can become better." "What does your heart tell you to do?" Linda asked gently. Margaret looked down at Hope, still curled up contentedly in her lap. "My heart says that forgiveness isn't about excusing what was done or pretending it didn't happen. It's about releasing the poison of hatred so it doesn't destroy me too. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. I can forgive Patricia for my own peace of mind without allowing her back into my life in the same way." Linda nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds very wise. You've been through an incredible trauma, Margaret. However you choose to handle this, whatever you decide is right for you, that's the correct choice. There's no rulebook for how to respond when your own children try to murder you." Over the next few weeks, Margaret thought deeply about Patricia's letter. She thought about her own values, about the person she wanted to be, about what kind of life she wanted to live in, whatever years she had remaining. She talked with her therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Rachel Foster, who specialized in trauma recovery. She talked with Linda and James. She even talked with Janet Rodriguez, the social worker who had helped her transition to her new life. Finally, one afternoon, Margaret sat down at her small desk and began to write a response. "Dear Patricia," she wrote, "I received your letter and I've spent considerable time thinking about how to respond. What you and your brother did to me was unforgivable in the truest sense of the word. You betrayed me in a way that no mother should ever be betrayed by her children. You left me to die in agony and fear, and that is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. However, I've learned something important in these past months. Holding on to anger and hatred hurts me more than it hurts you. It poisons my present and my future. So I'm choosing to forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. Forgiveness, though, does not mean we will return to the relationship we once had. That relationship is dead, killed by your actions. I cannot and will not have you in my life in the way you once were. The trust is gone, and it cannot be rebuilt. But I can acknowledge your remorse. I can recognize that you are genuinely sorry for what you've done, and I can hope that you use your time in prison to become a better person, not for my sake, but for your own and for your daughter's sake. They deserve a mother who understands the value of integrity, compassion, and family. I am doing well. I have a new home, new friends, and a new dog named Hope. I'm rebuilding my life, and it is a good life. I'm surrounded by people who genuinely care about me, people who value me for who I am rather than what I own. In a strange way, your betrayal led me to discover a community and connections I might never have found otherwise. I will not be visiting you in prison. I will not be writing regular letters. This may be the only communication we have for many years, if not forever. That is what I need for my own healing and well-being. But know that I do not wish you harm. I hope you find your own path to healing and redemption. Take care of yourself, Patricia. Your mother, Margaret." After sealing the letter and dropping it in the mailbox, Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had made her choice, had drawn her boundaries, and had taken another step toward healing. She walked back to her apartment with Hope trotting beside her on her leash, feeling lighter than she had in months. That evening, the community center at Sunrise was hosting a dinner and social event. Margaret had made several friends among the other residents, including a retired teacher named Dorothy, who shared her love of mystery novels, and a former engineer named Frank, who had an endless supply of terrible jokes that somehow always made her laugh. As she sat at a table with her new friends, sharing a meal and conversation, Margaret realized something profound. Her children's betrayal had nearly destroyed her, but it hadn't. She had survived. She had endured. And now she was building something new, something good. The life she was creating wasn't the one she had imagined for her later years, but in many ways it was richer and more fulfilling than what she had before. Linda and James arrived at the dinner, having been invited as honorary members of the community after the story of Margaret's rescue had spread throughout Sunrise. They joined Margaret's table, and the conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and warmth. "You know," Margaret said to Linda during a quiet moment, "I've been thinking about what happened that day in the desert, about how you and James just happened to take that particular road at that particular time, about how many things had to align perfectly for me to be found before it was too late." "I've thought about that too," Linda replied. "James almost took the interstate that day. He changed his mind at the last second. If he hadn't, if we'd been even 30 minutes later." "But you were there," Margaret said firmly. "And you stopped. And you saved me. And that led to all of this." She gestured around the room, encompassing her new life, her new friends, her new beginning. "I'm not glad my children betrayed me. That pain will always be with me. But I am grateful for what came after. I'm grateful for you and James. I'm grateful for this community. I'm grateful for the chance to rebuild." As the evening wore on, and the residents began to share stories and talents, Margaret found herself standing up when Dorothy encouraged her to share something with the group. She had never been one for public speaking, but something compelled her to share her story. "3 months ago," she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness, "I experienced the worst betrayal of my life. My own children tried to murder me, leaving me tied up in the desert to die. I don't share this to gain sympathy, but because I want you all to understand something important about resilience and hope." The room had grown silent, everyone's attention focused on Margaret. "I could have let that betrayal define the rest of my life. I could have become bitter and closed off, trusting no one, seeing only the darkness in humanity. And honestly, there were days when I felt like doing exactly that. But then I remembered something my own mother told me when I was young. She said that we can't control what others do to us, but we can control how we respond." Margaret's eyes found Linda in the crowd, and she smiled. "I was saved by strangers who became friends, who became family. I've been embraced by this community, by people who had no obligation to care about me but chose to anyway. I've discovered that even in our darkest moments, there is light if we're willing to look for it. Even when the people we trust most betray us, there are others ready to offer kindness and compassion." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm 79 years old. I don't know how many years I have left, but I know that I want to spend them surrounded by genuine connections, authentic relationships, and people who see value in kindness rather than personal gain. My children taught me what love isn't. This community is teaching me what love is." The room erupted in applause, and Margaret sat down, feeling emotional but also empowered. She had transformed her pain into purpose, her trauma into testimony. She was no longer just a victim of a terrible crime. She was a survivor, an example of resilience and a testament to the power of human kindness. Later that night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she looked at herself in the mirror. She saw an old woman with grey hair and wrinkled skin, with scars on her wrists that would never fully fade. But she also saw strength in her eyes, determination in her jaw, and something that had been missing for a long time: hope. Hope, her little dog, was already curled up on the bed waiting for her. Margaret smiled and turned off the bathroom light, climbing into bed beside her faithful companion. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thoughts were not of the desert, not of betrayal, not of the children who had abandoned her. Instead, she thought of Linda and James, of Dorothy and Frank, of Dr. Chen and Janet Rodriguez, of all the people who had shown her that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes family is about choice, about who shows up when you need them most, about who sees your worth when others see only what they can take from you. 6 months later, Margaret received word that David had been involved in a fight in prison and was being held in solitary confinement. She felt nothing but sadness for him, for the man he had become, for the life he had chosen. She said a quiet prayer that someday he might find his own path to redemption, but she felt no obligation to be part of that journey. Patricia, on the other hand, had been a model prisoner. She was taking college courses, participating in therapy groups, and by all accounts genuinely trying to become a better person. Margaret received occasional updates through Patricia's lawyer, but maintained her boundary of no direct contact. Perhaps someday, years in the future, they might be able to have some form of relationship again. But Margaret knew it would never be what it once was, and she had made peace with that. As Margaret approached her 80th birthday, surrounded by her chosen family at Sunrise Senior Community, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had survived attempted murder by her own children. She had faced death in the desert and been given a second chance. She had lost the family she had created, but found a new one in unexpected places. The story of Margaret Torres had shocked a nation when it first made headlines, but as time passed, it became something more than just a cautionary tale about greed and betrayal. It became a story about resilience, about the human capacity for both terrible cruelty and extraordinary kindness. It became a reminder that even in our darkest moments, even when those we trust most fail us, there is still hope, still love, still the possibility of new beginnings. And for Margaret, sitting in her comfortable apartment with hope asleep in her lap and photos of her real family, her chosen family, surrounding her on the walls, that was more than enough. She had been abandoned, betrayed, left to die, but she had survived. She had thrived. She had proven that even at 79 years old, it was never too late to start over, to find joy, to build a life worth living. Her children had tried to take everything from her, but they had failed. In the end, the only thing they had truly taken was their own humanity, their own capacity for love and connection. Margaret, despite everything she had endured, had kept hers intact, and that, she knew, was the truest victory of all.